So this week we're going to start talking about the S of Pestle, the social dimension. This is the third of the 6 dimensions of Pestle. As we've described in the previous weeks that we've been talking about Pestle, we're looking at the environment from a fairly broad to narrow perspective. We might have multiple definitions of an environment in mind as we start doing this analysis of Pestle. But really, for this particular course, we're focused on the general and the broad environment. We're focused on really the Pestle dimensions and starting to get a sense of that aspect of the environment, this broad environment, the general characteristics that can affect the way that business is done, but may not be under the immediate control of an organization. So this week, as you know, we're focusing on the social dimension. We've already been through the political and the economic ones. So we're going to talk about what the social dimension is all about today. But first, we're going to recap the economic dimension to a degree. So let's recap what we did last week. We described the E dimension of Pestle, which was economic. We defined economics and the economic dimension. We described major economic concepts and indicators, and we considered what fluctuations in those indicators mean. In other words, if there are changes in those indicators, what would it mean for business? What would it specifically mean for the hospitality business? We considered 2 different types of economic policies, specifically fiscal and monetary policy. We identified the overlap that exists between politics and economics, and we discussed the differences between those 2 economic policies and who has control over them. We recognized, however, that of course some are more political, or one of them is more political, whereas one falls more centrally within the economics realm. We discussed the importance of looking at all of the indicators in the economic dimension together to get a picture of the economy as a whole. And we described how we might want to be a little bit wary of the predictions that might come out about how the economy is doing or how it might be doing. We considered how important it is to be alert to changes in indicators and understand the effects of these. And we talked about some of the global issues related to economics, and particularly the spillover effects they might have, how they might have impacts on other regions that are nearby or somehow related. Just as a brief recap, we talked about the economic factors and dynamics. Some of the common ones are inflation, taxes and duties, finance and credit, interest rates, exchange rates. We talked about the cost of living, how expensive it is to live in a particular area, GDP and GNP, globalization, employment, and income statistics. A lot of these things you're going to be talking about in your economics courses. We don't have to get too deeply into it. But we do want to recognize that when we're analyzing the economics or the economic dimension of Pestle, we recognize that these are some of the things that we're going to be looking at and trying to understand and trying to pin down and trying to understand how they might affect the business environment as a whole. So just to be consistent, in all of the Pestle classes, we have a certain agenda, if you will. We would focus on each of the Pestle dimensions individually, and we'd ask a bunch of questions. So what is the dimension about in general? What do we mean when we say a particular dimension, a political dimension, legal dimension, or as we're discussing here, the social dimension? What are the factors, dynamics, forces comprising that dimension generally? What impacts could that dimension have on business and business decision making in a very general sense? And what specific effects can it have on hospitality industry decision making? We'll see that sometimes there are Pestle dimensions or factors within these dimensions that affect some industries more than others. And of course, we think of things from multiple points of view. We're also considering all of these from a global perspective, and that would comprise one of those points of view. So each of these classes, whether online or in class, has an interactive element. When we talk about the S of Pestle, the first question is obviously, what does a social dimension mean? And you know, in a lot of ways, the social dimension is really the broadest of all of them. It's very, very hard to pin down. When we think of the social dimension, we might focus on those who are vulnerable. Oftentimes, when we hear more of a social government, being concerned about the people, interests of the people existing within a particular society. When we talk about socialization, we think about how people become part of a society or part of a community. What sort of norms do they adopt and develop? When we think of socializing, we think of going out with our friends. We think of, going and having a drink or conversing, having a coffee with somebody, or meeting up with somebody and just connecting in some sort of way. The social dimension includes all of these to a degree. From my perspective, or our working definition that we'll use here, is it includes consideration of factors and dynamics describing and influencing how people live on a societal level, however this might be involved or whatever it might include. We will consider social norms and influences. We'll talk about quality of life and general well-being. We talk about factors that have implications for relationships, etc. So when we talk about social factors and dynamics, you'll see that this list is actually pretty broad. It includes things like demographics, the age, sex, and education that exists within a population. We'll talk about cultural norms, how people behave, what's considered to be right and wrong within a society, or more accurately, what it takes to be included within that society. We'll talk about religious aspects and how these affect the way that people are socially, and ethnicity. You can also think of it from a sort of access to education perspective. Do people have the ability to improve their social circumstances? Literacy, access to health care. We might talk about the languages that are spoken, the degree of interactivity. We might talk about the homogeneity or heterogeneity of a region. In other words, the degree to which a region or an environment consists of people who are very similar or not the same in terms of how they believe or how they think or how they behave, versus dramatic differences within a region. We talk about social mobility, the degree to which people could make their life circumstances better or maybe move up within society. We can talk about perceptions of time. And we'll note in this class that they're very different culturally, and they're very different person to person. We'll talk about birth rates and mortality rates, and talk about standard of living. We're going to spend a little time thinking about the Hofstede dimensions, which you'll understand a little bit better later. This might include lifestyle characteristics, how people spend their time, what they sort of do with their time, what sort of activities they engage in. And we can consider social equity within the social dimension. So you see, it covers a broad gamut of factors and dynamics, but really the one thing that's in common to all of them is that they're ways of describing people and the behaviors and the thought processes of people within a particular environment. So if you want to bring the list to life, you might want to think about other items that we can put on that list. Think to yourself for a moment. We recognize that some of the items on the list are pretty straightforward. The rate at which people are birthed and die is pretty easy to describe, and we can gather information relatively easily about this. It's readily available from organizations like World Bank. But normally we want to get a little bit deeper if we're to really understand the social fabric of a particular environment. If we want to really get a feel for the people and how they live, what social challenges they face, etc. So we often might want to consider this in terms of political or economic factors, and we might want to consider this using sort of ways that are untraditional. A few of the items on the list that are a little bit more interesting from this perspective are quality of life, culture, happiness, and perceptions of time. So we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about each of these in today's session, recognizing that these are ways of describing a social environment, and they're not the only ones, and they're not the only ones that matter, but they're sort of interesting and, may not be obvious to you. So let's talk about those. The first on that list is about quality of life. In the following video, you're going to be exposed to a newer definition of the standard of living. Standard of living has often been used in economic terms to describe the well-being of a society. It's based on the GDP of a society, and this is exactly what the problem with it is, as you'll see in the video. So as you watch the video, attend to how the definition of standard of living is now broader and not necessarily only contingent on the gross development product of a region. Think about why it might matter that there's a broader definition. Why do we care? And why might we want to adopt that broader definition as we try to analyze the social environment?
Which countries have grown the fastest in recent years? Many people might name Singapore or Korea. But Poland or Morocco might not readily come to mind. This is because for many decades, we have thought of national growth in terms of GDP, which shows the total value of goods and services a country produces. But what it doesn't show are some of the things that matter most to its people. Things like working public services, clean air, accessible education, safety from violence and harassment, and speaking freely without fear of arrest. So how can these factors be measured? This is where the Sustainable Economic Development Assessment comes in. Using 10 dimensions, it measures not only a country's economic performance, but its social and environmental sustainability, as well as the outcome of its long-term investments. Rather than giving a simple ranking, SEDA shows where countries are doing well and where more work is needed. And using it alongside GDP reveals how effectively a country converts economic growth into improvements in overall well-being. So although GDP growth usually yields some quality of life improvements, a few countries have achieved impressive results without a great deal of resources. After announcing a focus on the safety and well-being of all citizens, Poland made some of the greatest strides in sustainability and governance through policies like funding for renewable resources and establishing a central anti-corruption bureau. Morocco's promotion of women's roles in politics and society, as well as equal rights in marriage and property upon divorce, led to greater gender equality, which correlates highly with overall progress. And the central program in Brazil's successful drive to cut poverty in half cost only 0.5% of their GDP. The lesson from these very different countries is that improving well-being doesn't require a lot of money, but it does require good leadership, clear goals, and policies specifically focused on making the country and the world a better place for its people.
So in the video, you might have noticed that we traditionally based measures of standard of living on GDP exclusively. We understand now that this may not be a great indicator of well-being of a country overall, or of a region, or of an environment. When we refer to more than GDP, we're also looking at the factors that support people within an environment. Are people educated? Do they have access to medical services? Can they read? We recognize in Western society also that in spite of higher standards of living than elsewhere in the world, many people do not feel that they have a great quality of life. So we might ask why this matters from the perspective of this particular course. For one, characteristics within the social dimension can affect the target markets for companies' goods and services. Specifically, undetected shifts in the social dimension can cause companies to really lose sight of their target markets. This happened quite a few years ago when Mattel brand noticed that Barbie started to have a downward slide. And they had felt that the Bratz dolls that were also put on the market were not a clear threat to them at all. Unfortunately, girls really preferred the Bratz dolls. We also might decide not to do business in certain regions during for reasons related to their GDP. While these people might actually benefit from what our business has to offer. In other words, there might be a viable target market that we're not exploiting. A great example of this is McDonald's. When McDonald's went into Russia, Russia was using a different currency. Russia was not a great environment to be going into, but McDonald's did do that and created a whole following for their goods. Some might see this as exploitative, and I'm not suggesting that that's necessarily the way that business should behave. I'm merely recognizing that sometimes using traditional measures we might ignore certain characteristics of a market that make it a viable market for our goods and services. Of course, in some cases, being aware of the social environment can lead us to take certain precautions when doing business within those regions. For instance, if we have staff that are doing business in our company abroad, then we might want to make sure that they're protected in some way, or that our facilities special care is taken to make sure that they meet the necessary requirements of the people to make sure that there's safety. Moving on. Happiness is another characteristic that is usually not looked at using economic terms, and is very much a characteristic of the social environment. As you watch the next video, notice again how the definition well-being suggested in the video departs from those purely economic terms that we talked about earlier. Think about the implications of adopting one of the definitions or another when analyzing that environment. What are the limitations of thinking of environment in purely economic terms?
Hot air balloon that could go to space.
Like some hit singles, happiness transcends boundaries. But the reasons vary from country to country. The 2015 World Happiness Report, published by the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, uses experts in economics, psychology, health, and public policy to determine measurements of well-being across nations. In this year's report, Switzerland took the top honor, replacing Denmark, which finished third. Northern Europe continued to fare best overall, whereas the United States placed 15th, ahead of Brazil, but behind neighbor Mexico. According to Claire Bolger, editor and coordinator of the report, high income is a common variable at the top, but does not automatically translate to happiness.
Some basic level of income does matter. You need to be able to meet your basic needs, you need to be able to feed yourself, but after a certain threshold, income does not really matter for happiness.
Top-ranked countries also typically see low levels of corruption and strong social support. That is, having people you can count on in times of need. According to Bolger, social support is what largely differentiates Iceland, ranked second, and Greece, 102nd, in response to the financial crises that affected both. By comparison, the world's lowest-ranked countries, including much of sub-Saharan Africa, are often associated with extreme poverty, but not exclusively.
You now see Syria has dropped to the very bottom of the list. The Central African Republic is at the bottom, Afghanistan. So it's really countries that have had very, very, very poor countries and high levels of conflict and violence.
According to the report, other key variables that determine happiness include healthy life expectancy, freedom to make life choices, and generosity. Ramon Taylor, VOA News, New York.
Again, from the previous video, we see that economic and political factors are important, but they aren't everything. Standard of living as it's measured by economic means is simply not enough to get a sense of the social fabric of an environment. Quality of life and general happiness really point to the social character of an environment, and we would easily overlook it if we're to focus only on economic factors. Obviously, these ideas do have implications. Some of these social factors will have impacts on the economics, and some of the economics has impacts on the social. Certainly, we can see how political factors can affect the economics and can affect the social as well. We understand that these relationships do exist, but we're reminded that while we do notice overlaps between these pestle dimensions, it's really important for us to try to step back and look at each of the dimensions in an isolated way as well. So when we're looking at the social, we're looking at social factors, and then afterwards we can identify the overlaps that exist between the relationships that exist between the dimensions. In the case of happiness on a societal level, what we saw here is really not all there is about it. Studies have been done in general to describe happiness or unhappiness of a population. Some of the factors associated with happiness of a population we've already mentioned in these presentations, but there are additional ones as well. I've provided the links to those in the resources for this week's class. Net out, I think that we can assume that the degree to which a population is happy or unhappy can affect their worldview and has implications for their behavior, for their thoughts, and for their activities. As we move on, let's stop for a moment and get a little bit organized, recalibrate, if you will. We know so far that the social dimension has relationships to politics and economics, but is distinct. It helps us understand the nature and character of an environment in a way beyond what political and economic factors can tell us. For example, we look at things like quality of life and happiness. But there are other ways we might characterize the social environment as well, and one of those is through looking at culture. Culture is really complicated and hard to describe, but it has a lot of implications for how people in a society think or behave. And in fact, moves beyond a society. Organizations have cultures, communities have cultures, social groups in general can have cultural elements. Culture influences the norms within a group, the codes of conduct and behavior, rituals, and the types of things that are seen as important and unimportant. Perhaps the most comprehensive model of culture is presented by Geert Hofstede. Hofstede identified 5 dimensions of culture, and then he added a 6th in 2010. Let's look at his framework a little bit before we move on.
In today's globalized business environment, many of us work with people from different backgrounds and different cultures. This can pose new challenges when it comes to communication and motivation, especially when we're working with people who are based in other parts of the world. One way to understand these people better is to use Dr. Geert Hofstede's cultural dimensions. These are 5 dimensions that distinguish one culture from another. The first dimension is power distance. This describes how a culture responds to people with power and how it treats those who don't have it. The second dimension is individualism. This refers to the strength of the ties people have with others in their community. People in countries that score high in individualism are likely to value privacy. People in countries with a low individualism score will likely take more interest in other people's well-being. The third cultural dimension is masculinity. This dimension refers to how a culture views the traditional roles of men and women. For instance, a country with a high masculinity score often sees men and women working in distinct gender-defined roles. People in countries with a low score believe that men and women are equally capable of doing any task. The fourth dimension is uncertainty avoidance index. This defines how well people cope with situations where the outcome is uncertain. Cultures with a high score in this dimension need structure and rules to feel comfortable. Cultures with a low score are more likely to take risks and accept change. The last cultural dimension is long-term orientation. This looks at how a culture values long-standing traditions. Cultures that have a high long-term orientation show respect for tradition. Older people get more admiration, and education and training credentials are important. Cultures with a low score in this dimension believe more in equality. They're more creative and expressive. Keep in mind that these 5 dimensions won't apply to everyone in a specific culture, but you can use them to guide you when you work with people from different backgrounds and countries. Now, read the article that accompanies this video to learn more about each dimension. The article also links to Dr. Hofstede's website, which has detailed information on how specific countries score in each dimension.
Based on Hofstede's model, we can start to see that there are cultural characteristics that can be considered to be national in nature. These characteristics can affect the behavior and thoughts on a national level. So what? Well, there are a variety of implications. The culture of a region can affect our ability or desire to do business in or with those regions, and it might affect how we do business in or with those regions. It can affect how customers within those regions behave, or where we might actually look to try to attract new markets. It can affect how suppliers or competitors from those regions do business. It might also help us to gain perspective and recognize our own cultural norms, identify how those may be different than others. Hofstede elaborates on each of those dimensions in 10-minute segments. I've provided you with the links to those in the resources for this module. Look, Hofstede's model is not the be-all and end-all. Hofstede's dimensions have been criticized for being an overgeneralization, but his dimensions have also been confirmed by a fair bit of research. In other words, there's a lot of validity to them. At the very least, we can use his dimensions as a reminder that we shouldn't assume that everybody thinks and acts exactly the same way as we do, which is one of the errors that many companies have made when they've gone and done business in foreign environments. We also recognize the cultural characteristics of regions and organizations do exist. We have to keep in mind, however, that this doesn't necessarily mean that those environments are 100% homogeneous or that everybody within those environments are the same. Another characteristic of the social dimension that we can consider separately from or as part of culture is perceptions of time. When we talk about perceptions of time, we can see this on an individual basis as well as part of a larger societal culture. We'll talk about both of those. So if you've ever been waiting for a long time for someone, a friend or a family member, when they finally come, you're absolutely furious, but they seem totally unaware that they've been late. Or if you've ever experienced working in an organization where everything's very rushed and there's always these deadlines and timelines and time sensitivity. Perhaps you've worked in another one that's the exact opposite, very laid back. Not concerned about time, maybe more concerned about doing things right than getting them done. Well, perceptions of time are very much related to culture, but it might go a little bit deeper than that. So I'd like you to watch the following video.
Malibu asks, what if we Caribbeans took life as seriously as the rest of the world?
You're 43 seconds late.
According to my watch, I am not late.
You're late. And I am late because you're late. Now you're a whole minute late.
Not by my watch.
Hurry up, my fish is sick.
I'm running late for my meeting. You give me road rage. If we took life as seriously as this, then we would never have invented Malibu. Made with the finest Caribbean rum, Malibu. It's seriously easy going. Oh man, it's total gridlock.
Now, that video is not meant to be offensive in any way. It really is meant to be amusing, and it gives me a laugh every single time. It's a pretty accurate commentary on the differences between the way that Caribbean life is versus the way that North Americans tend to behave in a business setting. And in general, we tend to be a lot more rushed, whereas there tends to be a little bit more of a perception of time slowing down in Caribbean regions. You know, of course, this whole campaign was meant to sell rum. But let's think about what the video is really about. If you read the article that's linked here and also available in the resources section from this week, we'll think about the idea of there being different perceptions of time. I'd like you to, as you read the article, think about the implications of these different perspectives of time for decision makers and businesses. And think to yourself about whether this is a global phenomenon. How might insights in the article have implications for businesses operating on a local level? So when you take a time to read that article, I'd like you to think of those questions, and I suggest you pause the presentation now so you can do that. So let's do a little wrap up to now. We've highlighted factors and dynamics in the social dimension that we might not normally think about. That doesn't mean that the other items are not important. They are. These are just things that you might not normally have thought about when you were going through social dimension. Some of them are a little bit more loaded and complex and involve other dimensions as well. You know, if we were to look through that list, then we realize that social mobility is pretty important. Is it possible for people to move up in a society? Is it possible for people to move beyond their current social status? Leisure activities can have a big impact on the nature of a market. What are people doing in their spare time? What sort of opportunities might exist there? And what are the differences between where I am versus where I'm doing business? When we talk about homogeneity or heterogeneity, we might be talking about the similarity of people and social circumstances within an area, a region, or environment versus incredibly diverse or different as we'd expect in a heterogeneous environment. And we'd also look at social equity, obviously a big issue. We want to understand whether the environment has a perception of social equity, what sort of rights are there for people, whether there's discrimination. against women, against people of different races or perhaps of sexuality. We might understand that these could have impacts. For instance, imagine you're a tourism company. Why would you want to understand about what the characteristics or social characteristics are of places where you're going to be offering tours? You would want to be able to understand all of these features before you send people to certain regions. Anyway, I mean, the point is that basically we have a broad range of factors that we're looking at in terms of social factors, some of which we've highlighted here, but that by no means suggests that those are the only important ones. Again, we've recognized several times throughout this presentation that conceptually the social dimension is distinct from the other ones that we've talked about, but practically all of these are very intertwined. We understand that political factors can affect economic choices, can affect social policies and social norms. We understand that economic factors can affect political choices and social well-being. We understand that social factors can dictate economic priorities and choices. In other words, they're all interrelated and symbiotic. For example, standard of living will impact quality of life and happiness. We understand that economic factors dictate access to education and literacy. We understand also that political factors dictate social care for society, levels of corruption, preservation of certain social rules or norms. In other words, the dimensions are analytically mutually exclusive, but are still very strongly related, and we need to keep that in mind. The exercise for today's class is summarized in the following. We understand that demographics are considered within the larger social dimension, but really cross over with economic and political dimensions as well. I'd like you to look at the statistics linked here and available in your resources for this week. I'd like you to read to the end of the baby boomer section and start thinking, if you were a business operating in Toronto, why might you care about baby boomers? And if you're a hospitality and tourism business, why might you care about baby boomers? I'd like you to go beyond that and think about what you would care about millennials, or why you might care about millennials as a business operating in Toronto or as a hospitality and tourism business. Be as specific as you can and think as broadly and creatively as possible when you're answering this question. Post your thoughts to the discussion for this week.
And we welcome back to the program David Foote, the demographer and economist, professor at the University of Toronto, author, of course, of Boom, Bust, and Echo, Profiting from the Demographic Shift in the 21st Century. As I thank you for coming back and visiting us here at TVO, I want to start by putting up these so-called population pyramids and just having you take us through them for the years 1975, 2010, where we are now, and then 2045. So, if we can, let's bring these up, and you can tell us the significance of what we're seeing.
Well, the big bulge at the bottom, of course, is the baby boom. They're basically aged 10 to 30 in 1975. Preceding them, you see a real dent. That's the Depression. By, of course, now the boomers are in their 40s and 50s and 60s. So the front end of boomers in their 60s. And then, of course, by 2045, many of them are gone. And that's the pyramid that it results.
And the fact that the bottom of that pyramid is disappearing is significant to us because of what? Why is that important for us to know?
Well, the future growth of an economy depends on new people coming into the workforce. And not that necessarily growth is a good thing. It has environmental consequences. But with a slower growing economy, you're not going to collect as many taxes, and you're not going to be able to grow yourself out of deficits nearly so easily.
We've heard this expression, generational equity. What does that mean?
That means that a generation gets out what it puts in. So if you pay taxes in, at some stage the expenditures come out, and it should be roughly equal when added up over time and appropriately discounted.
But if the bottom of the pyramid's disappearing, is that going to be a problem?
It can be a problem. It doesn't have to be a problem.
What would prevent it from being a problem? Because of course, everything we hear nowadays is, oh my goodness, we're going to hell in a handcart because that bottom generation, not enough replacement for what we've been to. How could it not be a problem?
Well, there's 2 or 3 different explanations. One is you can increase productivity, output per person can go out, and therefore fewer numbers of people can be compensated by more output. And that's what we often hear from the business community, who, by the way, isn't investing so that we can increase output per person. But that's a whole other story.
That's another show. That's another program.
But secondly, of course, you can get revenues from many different many different mediums. And is the financial sector, more and more of us are saving for retirement. The financial sector has all sorts of resources. And if we raise taxes, you can easily pay for a lot of what's coming down the road.
Let's call this next segment of our conversation, or I guess we are calling it, Is Grandma Raiding the Piggy Bank? And let's bring up again some other numbers here which will indicate what we're talking about. Here's healthcare spending by age as of 2007. If you are less than a year old, more than $8,000 per capita is being expended upon you. Then from ages 1 to 64, apparently you don't tap into the healthcare system very much at all. It's less than $2,000 rather per person. But look what happens once you hit 65. More than $10,000 per capita. Canadian Institute for Health Information collects all this information, and there we go. Now, is there a case for concern when most government spending on healthcare is focused in the OECD countries on those who are over 65?
Well, you've got to be very careful. First of all, we'll spend less on education. So there's places where we can save money as well in an aging population. Secondly, that's over 65. Well, really, that doesn't kick in now until over 75 or even over 80 because we're living longer. New information shows that life expectancy has been going up. So this is a little bit in the future. And in the most recent past, the reason that we've seen so much pressure on healthcare is the Roaring Twenties generation. Someone born in the 1920s has reached age 80 in 2000, someone born in 1930 in 2010. So we've had the Roaring Twenties generation, lots of births in the 1920s. And they've been going through the healthcare system. That's why we've been seeing so much increase in healthcare expenditures.
So if you wanted to break down that final category a little more, let's say 65 to 85 and then 85 plus, we may be spending only $5,000 per capita on the 65 to 85, but we're maybe $20,000 per capita on the 85 plus?
That's right.
Well, and that's the fastest growing demographic out there, isn't it?
Well, it's the fastest growing, but there's still not a lot of people in those categories. There's still, and many of the boomers might want to keep working if only we'd redesign pensions so that they could keep working. So it's not as big an issue as it's being blown up to be.
Okay, but the fear is this is going to break the bank. You don't say, you're not going there.
You don't think the banks just broke the bank in the last little downturn? Give me a break.
The bank's already broken?
The bank's already been broken.
Okay. Here's, you read David Brooks in the New York Times, I bet, from time to time. Here's what he had to say very recently on this. One of the keys to healthy aging is what George Valiant of Harvard, your alma mater incidentally, calls generativity. Generativity. Providing for future generations. Seniors who perform service for the young have more positive lives and better marriages than those who don't. As Valiant writes in his book Aging Well, biology flows downhill. We are naturally inclined to serve those who come after and thrive when performing that role. The odd thing is that when you turn to political life, we are living in an age of reverse generativity. Far from serving the young, the old are now taking from them. First, they are taking money. According to Julia Isaacs of the Brookings Institution, the federal government now spends $7 on the elderly for each $1 it spends on children. Second, they are taking freedom. In 2009, for the first time in American history, every single penny of federal tax revenue went to pay for mandatory spending programs, according to this fellow from the Urban Institute. As more money goes to pay off promises made mostly to the old, the young have less control. Third, they are taking opportunity. For decades, federal spending has hovered around 20% of GDP. By 2019, it is forecast to be at 25% and rising. The higher tax rates implied by that spending will mean less growth and fewer opportunities. Already, pension costs in many states are squeezing education spending. And finally, in the private sphere, in other words, seniors provide wonderful gifts to their grandchildren, loving attention that will linger in young minds, providing support for decades to come. In the public sphere, they take it away. What do you say to all that?
3 or 4 different reactions. First of all, that's the US data, and that's not Canadian data.
Are we different?
The US, yes, somewhat different. The US have higher birth rates, so therefore they need more money in education. The squeezing out of education is more relevant south of the border. Secondly, and this is a common argument used, it only looks at the federal level of government. And the senior levels of government responsible for older people, and as you move down to provincial and local governments, they're responsible for young people. A long time ago, I did a paper showing how those ratios change dramatically as you look at lower levels of government. Under our Constitution, the municipal government is responsible for playgrounds and all the young people. So if you just concentrate on federal spending, you come up with these alarmist figures. And you've missed most of the boat, most of the spending. So you've got to be really careful before you start just quoting those figures. You've got to look at the total government spending at all levels of government to come up with a much more balanced point
Okay,
of view.
fair enough. But why would we be dramatically different from the United States?
Well, the
basic point, wouldn't it
the
be the
US
same?
is dramatically different from the rest of the developed world. They're still having over 2 children, or around 2 children per family. The rest of the world's only having 1.5, and in fact in Europe and Japan and so on, it's about 1.25. And that makes a huge difference over a 25, 30, 40 years span.
So they're certainly replacing their baby boomers a lot faster than everybody else.
But that
is.
means they also need the money for education now, because they've got a lot bigger percentage of the population under age 20 than much of the rest of the rest of the world can save a little bit money on education to help pay for healthcare.
Don't we help our pyramid by having the high levels of immigration, though?
Well, yes, we have high levels of immigration, but first of all, the population growth is still like half of 1%. Mm-hmm. So even with high levels of immigration, we're not getting...
It's not going to do it.
It's not going to do it.
Okay. Let's try this. You know that we hear all the time that this is the worst recession since the Great Depression. Doesn't have to be true, but we hear it all the time. Mixed with the financial meltdown that we had last year, it might be the most unique set of circumstances since the Great Depression. I know what you want to tell me, but hold off on this for a second. Here's what your colleague, Philip Oreopoulos, had to say in the Globe and Mail. The U of T labor economist, Philip Oreopoulos, has examined what happened to Canadians who graduated in the past 2 recessions, so early 80s, early 90s. He's found their earnings lag peers who graduate during good times for a full 8 to 10 years. That wage gap is likely to happen in this recession too, he said. The good news is that gap eventually closes. Recession-era grads' wages usually catch up after a decade. The bad news is twofold. Their lifetime earnings suffer, and those who graduate from less prestigious universities or programs never fully catch up. Okay, a bunch of stuff to unpack here. First of all, is this the worst recession since the Great Depression?
Well, the youth unemployment rate, let's just use the youth, is currently around 15%. So that's really tough. I really feel for my students as they go out looking for their first job. It's never been easy to get your first job. My heart's with them. But in the early 90s, that 15% was 7%. And when the tail end of the boomers came into the job market in the early 80s, that was 19%.
So
in fact,
19 in the 80s, 17 in the 90s,
and it's 15
now.
today.
So empirically speaking, if you're a young person looking for a job today, it was worse 10 years ago and 20 years ago.
It was probably worse for your parents who came out in the early 80s.
And they don't want to hear that.
No.
Still tough to get a job today.
Still tough to get a job. Your first job's always been difficult.
Okay. How do you think this recession is going to affect the potential earnings of young people looking for a job today?
Much the same. I would agree with Phil, my colleague, that basically you do suffer. You start at a lower level, and the probability of getting a job is lower, and you probably do suffer for 8 to 10 years. Those are people who graduated in the early 90s. They really didn't get on track until the late 90s. You delay marriage, you delay buying a house, and so it is tough if you graduate in a recession.
Does it make sense then to stay in school longer?
It always makes sense to stay in school longer, you know.
And you're
I'm not saying that because I'm a
self-interest.
professor. The more education you've got, the less probability you are of being unemployed.
Okay, but U of T doesn't need any more grads, right? They're full enough. But you still say it's a good idea to stay in school longer?
I still say it's a good idea to stay in school longer. I mean, it's very, very clear. And by the way, the U of T may be packed to the gills today, but 10 years from now, watch out.
Meaning they're not going to be?
College and university enrollments are going to plummet.
They're going to plummet. This is totally off topic, but you can't just say something like that without my being curious about
Numbers
what
of
it
births
means.
started down in 1992. When did they reach age 19?
So
2011.
Okay.
So enrollments are going to go down.
But the province is going to spend $300 million building new spaces for all the foreign students who are going to come here and take their places, so the classrooms actually are still going to be packed to the gills.
That's probably true.
That's the hope, anyway. Let me read you something from, you're very funny, David Foote. Let me read you something from the Edmonton Journal here. You got me off track. Christopher Reagan, Associate Economics Professor at McGill University in Montreal, which I also hear is not a bad post-secondary institution. Also, Senior Advisor to the Federal Finance Minister, recently told the Economic Society of Northern Alberta that an aging workforce foreshadows reduced tax revenue and skyrocketing healthcare spending from 2020 to 2040 in particular. Right now, he says, we have 5 people working for each senior citizen. 5 people are producing stuff. By 2040, you will have 2.5 producers per senior. He said, our standard of living is mathematically determined by dividing our gross national product by our population. During the past 40 years, a bulging part of our population was employed, so our productivity and therefore standard of living went up, but massive retirement can change that. Question: can younger generations maintain the standard of living enjoyed by baby boomers in Canada, where a large proportion of people are retired?
Again, a big issue. First of all, if you let some of those people in their 60s and 70s continue to work, not full time, then that can help offset this. Number two, it's not something new. We've known about this for 50 years. We should have been planning for it for the last 50 years, and that means we shouldn't have been cutting taxes. Number three.
You want to be the politician that explains that to people?
Do you want to go there in the show today?
Okay.
But that's the last thing you should be doing in an aging population is cutting government revenues, really.
Because you need those revenues.
You
to
need
take
those
care of
revenues, and we were in great shape until the recent downturn. And Canada was probably in better shape than almost any other country in the world in that regard too. So there are lots of things we could do. I mean, this analysis, and I certainly respect the point of view on the table, assumes that you retire at 65, you immediately start using healthcare. There's a lot of things that we can do to allow people to continue work till they're 75, to put off using healthcare till their late 70s and 80s.
Would it be fair then to blame seniors for not vacating the workplace fast enough to give younger people a chance to get into those jobs?
Wait a minute, the boomers are only 62, 63 now. They haven't turned 65 yet. They don't turn 65 till 2012, so just be patient.
Can we blame them then?
If you want to, you can do anything you want, Steve.
No, but I'm saying, there is this argument that they kind of have a responsibility
Well, but you can't have it on both sides. You can't expect them to exit the workplace and then complain there's a burden on the young people. If you don't want the burden on the young people, you want to keep them working, so they pay taxes. Come on, you can't have it both ways.
Yeah, I hear you. But, there's guys like in the States like Pete Peterson who say we've got a generational, never mind urban, rural, never mind, red states, blue states. We have a generational war in the offing here between the young and the old.
That's an American point of view again.
Not here.
You won't see that here. We're much more cooperative. And I've already suggested to you that if you allow the boomers to continue work 3 days a week for 60% salary, then they'll vacate some of their positions, make jobs for the young people, we'll have much more intergenerational understanding, and we'll continue to produce output.
What's preventing that harmonious outlook you've just described from happening right now?
It's in most pensions, for example, if you've got a pension or even if you've got an RSP, you can't both contribute and withdraw in the same year. You've got to retire full-time and then come back on an arrangement. Why shouldn't I be able to work 3 days a week for 60% salary? And the 2 days I'm not working, I withdraw from my pension. The 3 days I am working, I contribute to the pension. That's what's stopping a lot of this flexibility now.
Smart pension reform.
Yeah. And we're talking about pension reform, we're not talking about this sort of pension reform.
All right. Let me ask you one last thing about property. Speculation with many property owners eventually passing away when this generation is many years down the road, there could eventually be an oversupply of housing units leading to cheaper real estate prices for future generations. And you are the guy who thinks demographics explains 2/3 of everything, so does that make sense?
Again, you've got to do it a lot more carefully than that. You would have said the same thing about big Rosedale houses, but what happened to the big Rosedale houses? They got split up into 2 or 3 condos. So big houses can have alternative uses down the road. So it depends on the level of immigration. Right now, house prices are high, but mortgages are a historic low. The young generation today loses on the price of property but gains on the value of the mortgage. They don't have to pay nearly as high interest rates as most of the boomers did. So again, it's an argument that bears a little more deeper analysis than.
Okay. And just finally, if you are a young person and you choose not to go back to university again and take David Foote's class, but rather you want to graduate now, you want to go out and get a job, what are the jobs that young people are going to be getting?
No, the most important thing is to be flexible. Be really flexible. Be ready to take your whatever you've got that makes you a little different, and which isn't your education. Some of it is your personality and so on. And go out there and get a job and be flexible. Move around the country. Move around your occupations. Think flexible. How can I use what I've got over here? And that is the key way to get jobs.
Find something you like to do and figure out how to get paid for it.
And how you can link your past into that, so that you can convince the employer to pay you.
Gotcha. David Foote, as always, thanks so much for coming to TVO tonight.
My pleasure.
I'm not sure how far you got within that presentation, but I do want to just present you to the ideas of David Foote. Foote came out with a book that was very well received and very influential in business circles. The book was called Boom, Bust, and Echo, and it really got into the implications of generational shifts for business and the larger economy. From the video, we're again reminded that we want to ensure that we look at each of the dimensions independently and assess it and account for it, but we are also interested in those relationships and the symbiosis. In summary of today, the S is the social dimension of PESTLE. The social dimension, as we've used it in our working definition, includes consideration of factors and dynamics describing and influencing how people live within a society or environment, whatever might be involved. This might include consideration of things like social norms and influences, quality of life, general well-being, and relationships. We focused on a few factors and dynamics within the social dimension, specifically quality of life, culture, happiness, perceptions of time. We recognize that these are but a few of the items on the list, and we also recognize that all of them are important and can impact the climate of a particular environment. The impact on an environment is the independent from the impact on a business. We need to understand the environment if we're to speculate about the links to business. In other words, we need to understand the social factors independently, and then we can start to examine how that relates to or impacts businesses within that environment or affected by that environment. Today, we spent a little bit of time looking at overlaps between the dimensions, and we reiterated that it's necessary for us to think of these as mutually exclusive for analytical reasons, but recognize that they're also very much interrelated. And our examination of demographics showed just that. Social factors are very much tied to economic and political factors. Our next class is in week 9. That's the week after intersession, and will be an online session. The focus will be T of PESTLE, that is technology. Recognize that all of the week 7 requirements are going to be due by the start of our scheduled class time on week 9, even though our class will be online in week 9. We recognize again that oftentimes you'll have to check back quite a few times throughout the time between when something is assigned versus when it's due, so that you can contribute to the discussion in an ongoing fashion. Your PESTLE CNA for this week will be due the night prior to our scheduled week 9 class time at 11:59 p.m. as are all assignments. And you should be prepared to use your submission in some capacity for class on week 9. Remember that you're expected to check your school email and Blackboard regularly. You are expected to come back several times, particularly for online courses and online sessions. These are my only ways of communicating with you outside of class time. And as always, if you're confused about anything at all, please send me an email so we can set up a time to speak, or so I can answer your questions over emails. Do not send me emails over Blackboard. It's proven to be unreliable. Please send them through George Banner email. Thank you very much and have a good week till next time.